stop worrying. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Eno, and I am a worker owner at Red Emma's, very worker-owned coffee shop, restaurant, and bookstore here in Baltimore. And for all you out-of-towners, make sure to stop by if you ever come into town. And for all of you who live here, you of course already know about us. Let's see. I think I may. For some reason, I'm stuck on you, Nicole. Interesting. Unpin video, maybe. Okay. Anyway, yeah. So we are happy to co-sponsor this event today with UMBC and the Baltimore Field School. There's already a bunch of y'all waiting to watch this right now. So I'm just gonna not delay any longer. Check the description of the video for a link to buy Lewis's book. And I'm gonna turn it over to Nicole Kang for UMBC.
Thank you so much, Eno. And thank you to Red Emma's for hosting, and to our sponsor, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And all of our co-sponsors, the Department of American Studies, the Public Humanities Program, the Drescher Center for the Humanities and Maryland Traditions. I'm Nicole King, and I am the chair of the Department of American Studies at UMBC, and so excited to be here tonight with the kickoff for UMBC's 2021 Baltimore Field School. And this is a project that strives to envision models for ethical humanities research and teaching collaborations working with communities in Baltimore City. The project is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and we are excited this week that we have 14 Baltimore Field School Fellows who are university professors and grad students who will be thinking critically together with us this summer, working with community partners in Baltimore to develop individual and collaborative projects. So we'll be thinking through the ethics of public humanities work, and that's one of the reasons we are here tonight. You can check for more information on the Baltimore Field School project at baltimorefieldschool.org. So I want to really shout out the View from Somewhere book and podcast, because the podcast episode that really inspired tonight's event was the one on the end of extractive journalism. Extractive journalism means when you're reporting on communities without their input and without accountability. And that podcast and that whole project was really inspiration for our thinking in tonight's event. So I want to really welcome, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker, Lewis Raven Wallace, who is an award-winning independent journalist based in Durham, North Carolina. He's co-founder and co-director of Press On Southern Movement Journalism Collective, the author of the book, The View from Somewhere, Undoing the Myth of Journalistic Objectivity, and the host of the View from Somewhere podcast. Lewis has worked previously in public radio and is a longtime activist engaged in prison abolition, racial justice, and queer and trans liberation. He is white and transgender and was born and raised in the Midwest with deep roots in the South, like myself. So the discussion following our talk this evening will focus on how journalists and scholars working in the field might learn from one another and collaborate to build more equitable and ethical methods in humanities research. So now, without further ado, we welcome Lewis Raven Wallace.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you, Eno. Thanks everyone who's collaborated on setting this up. It's great to see everyone in the void. I can't really see you and I wish I could. But I'm here in Durham, North Carolina. I'm on land that is traditional Occaneechi and Eno Saponi tribal land. And very excited and honored to be here talking with y'all. I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing and then come back out of that and just talk for a while and then a little more screen sharing. So I am Lewis Wallace. My pronouns are he, they, or Z. Any of those are fine. And what I'll be talking about today is kind of an overview of the story behind and the arguments in my book and podcast, The View from Somewhere, which is primarily a critique of objectivity, the mythology of objectivity in journalism. But I'm excited about this conversation tonight because it's also an opportunity to go beyond that critique and into, I hope, fruitful discussion about methodologies for journalism and research that is less oppressive. So this is me. I always kind of wear two hats in these things. I'm a co-director at Press On, which is a collective of folks in the South working on issues of media justice, specifically working with journalists, and I do the education work at Press On. And then I also wear the View from Somewhere hat. And I'm actually going to stop that screen share now just to do a little talking about myself. So we're sure to come back to, I like to always kind of ground the story of this research in the story of how I came to the research. And I came to journalism through a pretty circuitous path. I had been an activist for many, many years. And the reason really that I became an activist was a reason of personal identity and experience. I came out as queer and trans in the late 90s when I was a teenager. And at that time, especially when it came to being trans, genderqueer, non-binary, there was very little material, media, storytelling out there in any kind of mainstream platform or accessible big platform about trans people. We were studied, we were talked about, we were medicalized. There were non-trans doctors who'd done research on us and books that you could read by them. But the idea of trans folks telling their own stories or our own stories about our experience and shaping possibilities about our identities was very much existing in the underground, right? And in the subcultures that we created. And so I was really engaged with making zines, and a lot of us were using the very early internet on, LiveJournal. I don't know if anyone remembers that prototypical blogging platform. But lots of trans folks in the 90s found each other that way, and found each other just through really kind of grassroots ways of connecting and storytelling. And so the way that I came into telling nonfiction stories, telling stories that were true, was really about building connection with other trans people, building justice and access for trans youth, and telling stories that we were pretty much guaranteed not going to find in any supposedly objective mainstream kind of outlet. And that work led me into a whole kind of community of people who are working for justice and liberation in different ways. And I learned a lot from other queer and trans folks, and specifically from folks of color, about racial justice, and about, alongside investigating my identity as a trans person, investigating my identity as a white person, and did a lot of writing and research about my own family history and my Southern family history, and the histories of racism and enslavement, and the present day of racism within my family and my lived experience. And again, came to this storytelling work and nonfiction work from a really kind of community-driven and politicized angle. And I did that work for many years in a grassroots kind of way, with lots of different volunteer organizations and projects and groups, and moved around quite a bit, and ended up in the city of Chicago, where I was working for a time with an organization called Project Mia, that is a prison abolition organization founded with the vision of ending youth incarceration. And we were documenting stories about young people's encounters with police, and specifically teaching radio and audio interviewing and journalism skills with youth, so that they could interview each other and tell their own stories, in order to create tools to encourage community members to not call police on young people of color in the city of Chicago. Through that work, I got connected with some folks at a public radio station And I ended up going into journalism through a fellowship that was for community organizers and activists. And when I got into that world, it was kind of wild. Like it was really amazing because I love radio stations and I love community radio, and people, it's very exciting and engaging. And I'd never really been in an environment like that. And I had never really imagined myself as, like a real journalist or somebody who would have access to a space like that. I'd never heard of or known of a trans journalist. There was no like framework of, someone like me kind of rolling up in there and looking for the gender neutral bathroom. But there I was, and I was so excited and engaged by it. And there was this initial kind of conversation that was like, okay, Lewis, what community issues are you involved in? What organizations are you connected to? Okay, so we won't have you work on any of those stories because that would be a conflict of interest or that could convey bias. And so it was a very funny, almost like opposite day moment, where I was like, I've spent 15 years in this world where telling your own story and speaking from your experience of oppression is like the central thing that we value, and centering people who've experienced oppression. And then coming into this space where it's like, oh, if you're close to a story, quote unquote, then that disqualifies you from telling it. And I just thought, okay, I don't know what that's about, but I'll try it on because I'm really interested in this profession. I want to be a reporter, and they're telling me that's one of the things I have to do. So I tried it on, and I ended up remaining a reporter and sort of scrubbing my public profile as an activist to some extent, remaining a reporter for many years in public media, and covering the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in where I was in Southwest Ohio in 2014 and 2015, and then covering the primary elections, primary presidential campaign. Donald Trump was a really big figure in 2016 in the coverage that I was doing, and came to Ohio a few times. And I was often filing those stories, both for my local public radio station and for NPR Marketplace, and really kind of deeply involved in the framing, and I think in many ways the false framing of the presidential election of 2016 that sort of focused on this image of the Trump voter, the abstract, Southern or Midwestern Trump voter as this working class white person, but not necessarily racist, and that really sort of assiduously avoided talking about racism. And I would say that I, as a reporter, participated in that, right? Like that sort of avoidant language, like racially charged comments or racially sensitive interactions that were used to describe Trump in the early days. And during that same time period, I moved to New York to work for a national show reporting on economics, and was there when the election happened and the inauguration. And I was seeing really firsthand the immediate consequences of violence and backlash in my communities. So, a rise of just open street violence against people of color, against Muslims, against trans people. These were the groups who were being scapegoated. Black people, specifically, the city of Chicago was another scapegoat that Trump liked to harp on. And the consequences in terms of day-to-day lived fear and violence were very real. And there was this kind of attitude within the mainstream newsrooms of, well, we just, the priority for us is just to report the news, and we don't want to appear biased, and we want to seem fair. So we can't name Donald Trump's racism or stand up to Donald Trump's attacks on free speech and fact, or on trans communities or on BIPOC communities. And I reconnected in many ways at that time with my activist roots, right? And was like, y'all, what do we need to be doing in journalism at this time? and there was a really strong sense, right, that journalists had an important role in revealing what was going on, and specifically revealing, the racial dynamics, and also revealing the systems and structures, right? That this stuff that Trump is giving a platform is not new. It's actually upheld by systemic racism and institutions that were intact before Trump and continue to be intact. And there was a clear sense from within my community that it was important to kind of push for that framing in this time, and that journalists should be people who are helping to make meaning out of this moment and not just sort of performing neutrality. I wrote a blog post around that time about that idea, like, okay, so there's all this stuff going around about fake news and alternative facts, and it might seem really scary, but actually objectivity has never been real. And one way that we can kind of take a stance in this moment, or in some ways gain an advantage, is to just claim what we stand for as journalists, right? And openly reject white supremacy and transphobia as journalists, and openly reject attacks on journalists. And as a result of that blog post on my personal blog, I was suspended from my job as a reporter. And I ended up, when I declined to take the post down, I ended up getting fired. And after that, made a decision to go public with that story. And the reason for that decision was sort of two things, but the biggest one was that I saw in public media, specifically where I had worked for 5 years at that point, a lot of doublespeak around issues of diversity and inclusion. So there's this idea of like, we want diversity and we want people of color here, and that's a good thing. Or we want trans people, or it would never be plural, but we want a trans person here, and that's a good thing. But we don't want them to stand up for their community, to be advocates in any way, to sort of prioritize their own identities over the professional standards of journalism. And to me, that was a very hollow, and I think to many people who come before me and left that environment, that was a very hollow offer. So after I got fired and told the story of being fired, and told it just sort of plainly in a public way, so many people got in touch with me, right? It said, this is why I left. And it was primarily people of color and queer and trans people said, this is why I left journalism, or this is why I, couldn't do the kind of reporting that I wanted to do, or didn't end up finishing journalism school, or, was pushed out or fired. And so it became really, really clear to me, something that I'd already had an inkling of. I am not the first person, right, who has thought about this or shared this critique, and people are asking me for my opinion about objectivity and all this stuff. And I thought, okay, what I need to do is zoom out and go back and use this privilege of this platform and this opportunity to learn some of those stories about the people who came before me, who had critiqued objectivity, who had understood it as a myth and understood the kind of harmful gatekeeping, and who in many cases had been punished or silenced, or kind of not recognized often as journalists within history. So that's what led me to this research in The View from Somewhere, which is really focused on these stories of other journalists in the past, as well as this idea of objectivity. Where did it come from? How did it start? Why is it still around? What might be useful about it? What can we let go of? So these are the questions that I've been grappling with for the last few years. This is the blog post. It's all still on Medium if you want to read it. And this is a little bit of just, that moment. It was a very intense moment in January, February of 2017, when Trump had just taken office, and a lot of mainstream journalism outlets were just like, what do we do? I have a passionate hope that we can continue to learn from that moment and that time and transform the practice, but we'll come back to that in the discussion. So a little bit of the history, and I'm going to try to be quick with this. because I'm very excited about the cross-disciplinary discussion that isn't just journalism here too. But a little bit of the history, really before the early 1800s, there was no such thing as this sort of centrist or neutral or detached journalism. There were papers that were owned and run by political parties, and that was where most political reporting happened. And then papers that were owned by specific trades, so sort of commercial trade, economic reporting. Because of changes in demographics and more people moving to cities and more people rapidly becoming literate in English, there became a business incentive to sell a lot of papers for cheap to more people and then actually make money off of advertising. And so that was the penny paper. And that format and that change in distribution model was really the thing that drove and sort of incentivized a more nonpartisan approach to reporting. So these papers they wanted to sell, sort of exciting news of the day to people in the corner. They didn't want advertisers to boycott them or pull their advertising. And so they thought, let's stay out of some of this partisan politics stuff. They weren't that detached. If anyone ever gets to dig into the archives and look at newspaper headlines and covers from the 1830s to 1850s, it would not fly in today's sort of New York Times, Wall Street Journal type environment. But it was the beginning of a model for papers that were advertiser funded by purchases, by direct purchases, and that created an incentive for what would become this sort of performed objectivity in journalism. The newswire and the sort of quick distribution of standardized news items was another incentive toward that. And of course, during that time period, there was always pushback. There were always people who stood outside of this framework of a more detached or neutral paper. So, abolitionist papers, the Black press, writ large was in many ways an activist press that stood up and took a stance on certain issues at all times during the 1800s, suffragist papers, and I could go on about those kind of early examples. And a lot of times, I think the one thing important to say about that is that a lot of times, those papers were the only sources telling stories about their communities. So it wasn't just, you get this news from the white press and then you get it over here a different way from the Black press. It was like the stories about what's happening in the Black communities are not being reported at all in the white press. And so the Black press is creating is a form of activism just in terms of creating a meaningful alternative in addition to explicit stances that papers might take. So the sort of towering figure of this time period in terms of journalists who stood outside of this objective, this emerging detached framework for journalism is Ida B. Wells. She was born into slavery and grew up raising a bunch of her younger siblings, became a teacher. By the time she was in her mid-20s, she was the editor and publisher of the Memphis Free Press, which was the Black paper for Memphis. And she essentially became politicized around racial terrorism and lynching through her experience as a reporter. So she had a close friend who was one of 3 men who were lynched by a white mob in Memphis. There was a whole story told in the white press about that incident, and that essentially blamed the 3 Black men and said, they had instigated something and it was self-defense. And she knew that was not only was that a lie, but that it obscured a really important piece of the story, which was that the 3 Black men had been owners of a grocery store that was a competitor with a grocery store owned by some of the white people leading the mob. And so in many ways, it was both an act of racial terror and of economic terror that was followed by a series of lies about why it had even happened that criminalized these Black men. And one of them was a really close friend of hers. And so she said, I'm going to tell this story I'm going to tell what really happened. And it so happened that after her paper started reporting on that, she took a trip to New York. And while she was on the trip, people got in touch with her by telegraph and said, you can't go back to Memphis. It's not going to be safe for you. And her newspaper office was burned to the ground. And she ended up staying at that time in New York and working with the New York Age, edited by Timothy Thomas Fortune. And really embarking on many decades long investigation nationally into lynching and trying to find out, gathering newspaper stories and wire stories from all over the country, and then following up on them, in many cases going to the communities and finding out what had actually happened and how that differed from the story that had been documented, and creating a quantitative record of like, here's how many lynchings in these horrible years in the 1890s where there were hundreds each year. And then, here's not only that, here's the age of the people, and here's what they were accused of, and here's what we could find out about whether they even did that thing. And so really reshaping the narrative that was criminalizing the victims of lynching at that time. And so in that sense, Ida B. Wells is very much, I think, a precursor to the Black Lives Matter movement and the ways that Black Lives Matter has used media and social media to report out and investigate, and in many cases, tell the true stories behind Black victims of racial terror who have been criminalized by the popular media or by the white-run media. And I'm going to pause for a second so that everyone can read the Ida B. Wells quote if you haven't already. So the first part of that quote is quite famous. She's often quoted saying that, there is no educator to compare with the press. Matt Thompson, editor who is Black, who has been a really wonderful listener and contributor to The View from Somewhere, got in touch with me when he saw this poster and said, you should really put the rest of the quote on the poster, because it's actually kind of more political in some ways than just like the press educates. She specifically goes in, right, and says that the African-American, or at that time it would have been Afro-American papers, are the only ones who will print the truth at this time. And so I thought that was a really awesome kind of intervention from Matt Thompson and from Ida B. Wells in the first place. So she was really around and doing that journalism work in the 1890s, early 1900s, and even still, that was before this sort of formalization of objectivity as we know it now. So the early 1900s was when the first journalism schools were founded and journalism began to be more of a profession. And so obviously there was some gatekeeping that went along with that. University of Missouri Journalism School, of course, didn't integrate racially until almost 50 years after its founding. And that was following much, much protest and pressure. Along with this professionalization, the first ethical guides were created in the 1910s and 1920s. Some of this stuff is stuff that is sort of a no-brainer to journalists now, like don't take money from a source and then make up a quote that the source wants you to say, or those kinds of things, basic conflict of interest stuff. And then some of it also began to articulate this somewhat new idea of a detached and neutral outside observer. And by the 1930s, this concept of objectivity was more codified, and that term was actually being used. Initially, it was being presented as a methodology, a way to approach journalism using scientific methods, quote unquote, of verification. Of course, the scientific methods of verification that were being used even in other disciplines, including the hard sciences, have since been, debunked in terms of whether it's possible to ever remove those from power dynamics and issues of race, class, and gender. But at the time, this idea was being promoted that, like, okay, we can be like news scientists, and that's what will make us different from propaganda people, is that we'll go out and we'll research using the scientific method and we'll verify, and people will trust us. and they'll believe us more than they believe propagandists. But of course, really, really quickly, that framework was weaponized against people who were organizing, labor organizers, especially union organizers within the journalism field, Black and Indigenous and POC reporters, people who advocated for women's rights and later for LGBTQ rights and liberation, have had objectivity weaponized against them so many countless times under this accusation, right, of bias. And this idea that folks whose very humanity has been politicized are subject to more bias somehow than folks who have been privileged or allowed not to think about that identity. And that conversation just sort of interweaves throughout the whole 20th century with the racism of mainstream media, white-run media. So, of course, white perspective is a very intense and often invisible form of bias that was totally acceptable under this objectivity frame. The Kerner Commission report in 1968 specifically noted the ways that the white-run papers had not represented or told the stories of communities of color, Black communities specifically, and that was part of the reason behind the immense frustration in cities at the time, that folks saw a white perspective and a white bias in the papers. And of course, that led to this response of diversity initiatives and sort of bringing people in, but without changing these standards or these ideas, or sort of opening up to the discussion to how might we approach journalism completely differently, to be more driven by community and less attached to this idea of objectivity. I love to bring up the story of Ruben Salazar because he was somebody who reported within the mainstream journalism world for the LA Times and some other papers for many years, and kind of a groundbreaking Latino reporter. He was the first Latino foreign correspondent for the LA Times, and then he ended up coming back to Los Angeles to report on the rising Chicano movement in the late 1960s. And during that time, he kind of started to develop this critique of objectivity. So speaking of people who critiqued it way, way before me, he was like, I can't report in a meaningful and accountable way on my community while giving this performance of unbiasedness for the LA Times. And so he left and started his own show on a Spanish language station. Shortly thereafter, the police actually killed Ruben Salazar by shooting a tear gas canister through the window at him and his film production crew during a protest. They were inside getting food, and no one was ever held accountable for that killing. So just noting that, not only these folks who have come before with these critiques and with these lived experiences that have led them to take immense risks in order to report on their community, but just that so many folks have, given their lives, sacrificed just so much safety and comfort in order to tell these stories. And often, for the most part, Black and Indigenous and people of color are the ones who, as journalists, have faced that kind of explicit violent backlash that is state sanctioned or directly from the state. And then one of the sort of really important structures, supporting that in that time, the 60s and 70s, was the strategy of right-wing media activists who began to see that objectivity, quote unquote, this performed objectivity, was on their side, and that they could pit their own conservative ideology against oppressed people's viewpoints. So when you hear that phrase, liberal media bias, which we've all heard a bunch of times, it's important to know that this coining of liberal media bias actually started from right-wing activists in the 70s who realized, like, oh, anything we don't like, so it's reporting on Black urban life or reporting on gay young people, we can call that liberal media bias, and then say, it needs to be objective, it needs to be balanced, and then insist that one of our guys who carries often a pretty radical conservative ideology be brought on the show or brought into the conversation in order to quote unquote balance it. So very much a conscious strategy of using fair and balanced, which you hear from Fox News, or objective media in order to advance a kind of insidiously anti-people agenda. And we saw a lot of acceptance and sort of participation in that from more mainstream and liberal media outlets saying, okay, fine, we'll bring on Pat Buchanan or whatever to balance this out, who's a complete bigot. And not saying stuff that's true in any case. And so I think that this piece is so important because I think we're really still dealing with the consequences of that in a really intense way now, of like how conservative media activists have normalized radical conservative ideology as an acceptable sort of balance to the lived experiences and humanity of oppressed people. The whole debate, quote unquote, about trans kids right now is evidence of that same tactic and trend. So summing up the argument, my colleague, the producer of the podcast, Ramona Martinez, says objectivity is the ideology of the status quo. So it's not non-ideological, it's just status quo ideology. We believe and talk a lot on the podcast about how everything is ideological, including methodology. So there's no neutral, methodology. But we can look to this incredible legacy of movement journalists as folks who have developed alternative methodologies and used them really, really courageously in all these different ways. And often as a result, not been recognized as journalists, right? Or been seen as like just an activist or just a filmmaker or a rabble rouser, what have you. But for me, that's been really inspiring to find those folks and go, you know what, these are the journalists that I'm going to learn from and imitate and try to continue the legacies and traditions and practices of. I need a time check because I feel like I might be.
Lewis, it's actually about 6:09, so you can kind of wrap up in a few minutes, you're thinking?
All right, excellent. I think I just have a couple more slides.
Great, lovely.
So, of course, the question that follows on all of this kind of critique of objectivity and critique of status quo thinking in journalism is, well, what do we do instead? What's next? And that's the conversation that I'd love to have and I'm excited to have with you all. And I feel a lot of openness and curiosity, right, about how folks are thinking about this in different disciplines. So some of the kind of values that I have been bringing to my work over the last few years since I've been liberated from public media include centering anti-racism and a commitment to end oppression in the journalism work that I do. And so that plays out in everything from, which stories I tell to how I approach those stories and kind of accountability and responsibility to sources. Rigor and meticulousness. I think one of these sort of red herrings around the end of objectivity is that it's an end to being rigorous in our pursuit of facts or data or our organization of ideas. And of course, it's not an end to that. I think it's just an application of a more holistic analysis, right, of race, class, gender, and power in that rigor that often can lead to really different frames and really different conclusions about what is true or what deserves a platform or what needs to be told as stories go. Alongside that, applying a really rigorous and ongoing analysis of power to all of my work. So I think often in the field of journalism, it's really a lot easier for journalists to look at power structures outside of ourselves, right? And say, like, we're holding power to account. An ongoing power analysis also requires looking at ourselves. So what are the power dynamics in, my newsroom, my institution, in my case, the collective that I'm part of? the relationships between editors and reporters, the relationships between reporters and sources. There are all these kind of layers of power, often hierarchy, access, gatekeeping. And so a kind of openness to analyzing and looking at that is a really key value for me. At the center of all of that is, of course, holding on to curiosity at all times, and a kind of openness. And that, that doesn't mean that it's our job as reporters to report every opinion under the sun about a given thing, but that we're curious, we want to know more, we want to have as full a picture as possible, with the understanding that every picture is partial. But to me, curiosity is at the core as well of how we can conduct something like an ongoing power analysis. Like, we have to keep learning in order to do that. Vulnerability, I think, is a key sort of personal practice and value. The vulnerability to say, I don't know, or I might not be doing this right, or what do you think? To be held accountable, to make mistakes, those kinds of things. And that's truly, truly undervalued in traditional journalism. I was really inspired in that by a leader in the journalism world named Jennifer Brendel, who talks a lot about vulnerability as an asset in journalism. And I really have appreciated that intervention. And then transparency when it comes to building or rebuilding trust as reporters. Being transparent about our process, about how we do our work, can be one of the ways to sort of counterbalance this fear that, if we don't perform unbiasedness, that people won't trust us. I think showing our work is a way to say, trust me, not because I'm unbiased or outside the story, or lying to you about whether or not I have an investment in this. Trust me instead because I can show how I came to these conclusions. Or don't trust me because you don't know me. I think that's another confrontation that we're having in the journalism world, right? Is you can't be like, trust us now because we're fair and balanced. That rebuilding is a real process where trust has failed over many generations. So focusing on solutions, looking for not just like positive stories, but stories that focus on what people are doing for their own self-determination, their own liberation and community. And then finally, accountability to particular communities or movements. I think this is one of the most complex ones. It's also one that probably raises the most like hackles with journalists, because there is this like 1920s sort of idea of the individual journalist who's accountable to no one but himself. And this really challenges that, that a community or even a movement might hold you accountable. I firmly believe that it's possible to be rigorous and meticulousness and do fact-based work, and also have like the humility to say, I'm not going to get every issue of representation right, and I need to be held accountable by some broader collective outside of myself, as complex as that process may be and feel. So I think that vision slide is a mistake. The last slide I want to share is just a quick definition about movement journalism. Press On, where I work, has been advocating a lot around this idea of movement journalism. We do try to be really careful not to gatekeep it, right, or claim some sort of origin story with it. So many people have been movement journalists who didn't use that label. Lots of people now who might call themselves a movement journalist aren't necessarily accountable to movements. It's really easy to get lost in these silver bullet kind of terms, like movement journalism is the new solution. That said, we're really pushing this idea that journalism in service to liberation is not about turning journalists into soapboxes for activism, but about fostering collaboration between journalists and grassroots movements, recognizing the journalism that's already happening in grassroots movements, and supporting and lifting up those stories told by oppressed and marginalized people. And so that's really the work that we're trying to do at Press On. Again, as much as possible with humility about like not being the ones who came up with any of those ideas, right? That we're part of this long tradition of activists, writers, storytellers, journalists, people sitting on their front porch talking about what's happening in their community that is actually the core of sort of what community-driven journalism can be or could be. And I am going to stop there. Oh, this is the promotion slide. There's a book and a podcast, and I'm going to put the link to Red Emma's, where you can buy the book in a minute. And I will stop talking now.
Thank you so much, Lewis, for that time. I was really interested in so many of things. I felt like a lot of that was overlapping in work that I've done. And I wanted to take a moment because I realized that a book that I really like that kind of touches on a lot of the things you were talking about, and if any viewers would like to delve deeper, is News for All the People. Yes, it's like so nice. On top of Lewis's book, I think having the context is going to be really helpful as we all begin to look forward to how we want to hold reporters accountable for telling our stories. Also, I just want to say, I don't think I got a chance to introduce myself. I am Imani Spence. I'm the Baltimore Field School Program Assistant. I'm a UMBC 2016 alum and also a student at the University of Maryland, getting my master's in library and information science. And I'm going to be doing the kind of Q&A portion of this evening. And Lewis, like I said, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was a really great presentation.
Thank you, Imani. It's nice to meet you.
Yes, I'm glad we can meet in these new ways.
I know.
So odd. So now we're going to be moving into the second portion where we'll talk about research methodologies with Camille Maddox-Wingfield as well as Sarah Fouts. So I'm going to start with some bio introductions with Camille. So Dr. Camille Maddox-Wingfield is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Public Health at UMBC. Her primary areas of focus of research include dance, anthropology, spirituality, and religion in the African diaspora, feminist ethnography, and the Caribbean, and I think specifically Martinique from the research I've done. So Dr. Maddox-Wingfield will be our first presenter, and then after about 10 minutes or so, I'll introduce Sarah Fouts.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Imani. It's also nice to meet you in this virtual platform. I appreciate the invitation from my colleagues, Dr. Nicole King and Dr. Sarah Fouts. Lewis, welcome to this conversation with us. We're so excited to be talking to you about these issues that have long been pressing issues and questions and debates and conversations within the work that we do as ethnographers and particularly me in the field of cultural anthropology, and I'm sure Sarah will also speak to this. These are tensions that we've been engaging with our discipline for quite some time. And so I had prepared notes before even coming to this conversation, but I was like frantically jotting things down that came to mind as you were speaking, Lewis, because I see so much overlap in some of the challenges that we face, some of the vulnerabilities that we have to navigate. And so I just really appreciate this opportunity to kind of have a cross-genre dialogue about these issues, because they certainly resonate in our discipline of cultural anthropology. So we had some kind of questions that we would be thinking about engaging. I don't know if I should touch on them now or circle back to them after I just kind of give an overview of what I do in my research. Imani, do you have a particular preference on how you'd like to do that?
I think a good general overview will be perfect, and then we'll be able to get into it more specifically as we go to the Q&A.
Got it. Well, I'll give a very brief introduction to my work. I actually did my undergraduate training as a cultural anthropology major at Towson University, which is situated right outside of Baltimore. And so some of my early engagements with opportunities to do field work that were supervised by my undergraduate mentors, who are now my colleagues at Towson University, they had a commitment to getting students on the ground in the city of Baltimore doing ethnographic field research. And I'll talk more about that project in just a moment. But this question of extractive research, these are things that I had to navigate as an undergraduate with the supervision of my undergraduate professors before I even had the language and the kind of ability, the critical language to critique these power dynamics, before I had a deep training in kind of an ethical praxis. These were situations that we faced, in that we found opportunities to build community with the folks that we were doing research with. And so as an undergraduate, I did research with my professors at Towson University, Matthew Durrington and Sam Collins, on life in the city and questions of gentrification and changing neighborhood dynamics, the racial and class dynamics of gentrifying neighborhoods in Baltimore. And so because I grew up just outside of Baltimore, I kind of, partially consider Baltimore to be a home of mine. I was really committed to getting it right, even though it was my first experience as an undergraduate researcher. And it was because I had so many personal commitments wrapped up in the kinds of questions that I had. And so eventually, when my research interest shifted to the wider Black diaspora and questions of the Caribbean, it was because I had a study abroad opportunity in Jamaica. And then eventually, when I went to graduate school at the University of Florida, my interest shifted to Martinique. And so as the one who has a dance background, I've always been interested in what kind of politics and power dynamics shape people's decisions to engage in expressive culture and performance. And so Martinique is a really interesting case because of its ongoing colonial relationship with France. The fact that it's a non-independent island society of the Caribbean that is an overseas department of France, and therefore ongoing questions of coloniality and political and economic subordination to the French state persist, and they influence people's kind of local decision-making around cultural heritage preservation and the revival of certain traditions that are part of the ancestral past, such as music and dance. And so as someone who had a background in dance, I was really, really interested in using kind of my dancing body as a form of methodology to do participant observation, to build relationships and connections through long-term participant observation, and to use dance contexts for where I would go and meet people and cultivate relationships and build rapport with folks who would eventually become research consultants and interlocutors for my project. And so both in the context of doing research in Baltimore, which is like a home city of mine, and doing research in another location, another site of the Black diaspora in the Caribbean, I had personal commitments, political commitments, and curiosities that I think really informed the care that I took in the type of research that I would go on to do, right? And the kinds of training that I would seek out in terms of the ethical praxis and the kind of liberatory and decolonizing, the decolonial frameworks that would go on to shape my work as a researcher. So that's just a little bit of background about my kind of background in ethnographic fieldwork in two very different sites where I had to address similar conflicts and confrontations, and the ways in which we were creative in kind of overcoming those challenges. And so I'll return to some of those details once we get a chance to engage the questions that we've prepared. So thanks again for the opportunity to share this experience with you all.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Maddox Wingfield, that's so helpful. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I relate as someone who spent a lot of my formative years here in Baltimore, though my family is mostly in the Detroit area. I understand the value of trying to make sure you get it right. So thank you so much for sharing your ideas with us. Excuse me. Next, I will be introducing Dr. Sarah Fouts, who will also be giving an overview of research methodology. Dr. Sarah Fouts is an assistant professor in the Department of American Studies at UMBC. Her research interests include transnationalism, Honduras, New Orleans, ethnography, political economy, public humanities, and food studies. And Dr. Sarah Fouts is also one of the people who organized this event. So thank you so much, Dr. Fouts. And I think we're all ready for you to take it away.
All right, thank you, Imani, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lewis. I'm really excited to be here and have these conversations. And Camille, thanks for setting the stage and platform to talk about ethnographic research, because I'm really excited to engage in these discussions that we're having here. So, and yeah, my background is it's really interesting, hearing kind of Lewis talk about his work and kind of coming into journalism and these questions of objectivity. My background, and I will just openly admit this, is I was a Peace Corps volunteer. So if we're thinking about questions of, like U.S. empire, going into communities, et cetera, I've had to undo a lot of my thinking about research and et cetera. I came out with a lot of great experiences of that, but my understanding and my growth with a critical framework that I've acquired, mostly working with, in grad school, but also working with community organizations, grassroots organizations, really kind of understanding the power dynamics, et cetera, and taking in, unlearning a lot of those processes, et cetera. I have a master's from the University of New Orleans in urban studies, applied anthropology, and a PhD in Latin American studies from Tulane University. And my research it's ethnographic, where I have done, it's almost 10 years now of research in New Orleans with Mexican and Central American immigrants that arrived in the city in post-Katrina. And my research I use food studies to surface issues of like labor exploitation, land extractivism in the context of post-Katrina. And I've worked since 2011 with a group called the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. And I really started, it's hard to believe, again, it's been 10 years since I worked with them, and really kind of building, going with community organizers, me being a volunteer and a researcher with them, and going with one organizer in particular to different day labor corners where immigrant workers would wait for jobs. And when he would do organizing, helping him out in those processes, getting to know a lot of kind of the organizing and the work done by these immigrant communities, and as well as the multiracial solidarities that are built with undocumented workers, Central American immigrants, as well as Black New Orleanians who are low-wage workers that also work under kind of the umbrella organization of the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. So really being a part of these two groups as a volunteer, and then kind of later in my work with them becoming more kind of a collaborator in different projects, taking cues from different projects that they want to work on. So kind of working on my own academic book project, as well as kind of understanding how that can be more of a collaborative work when I'm working with folks at the Workers Center on these more public-facing projects, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Addressing my positionality is, I am a white queer scholar working in a place where I'm not from. I was in Paraguay in the Peace Corps when Katrina happened in 2005. So, I wasn't even there. I came to New Orleans in 2010 and was more of a part of kind of the gentrification that was happening in the city, living in a neighborhood that was being actively gentrified. So really kind of understanding my positionality as a researcher and as a person living in New Orleans in that time period. And all of that has informed my processes in writing a book, as well as engaging with Lewis's book, which was super helpful in thinking about it being extractive and extractive storytelling. So one of my chapters is really kind of interrogating my own research methods and really kind of looking at being introspective in, kind of the mistakes I've made, kind of this very vulnerability that Lewis talked about, as well as, the accountability that comes out of it, working with communities, being called out, or, learning constantly, and then, really kind of checking in throughout the process of doing this type of research. And the last thing I really want to kind of say is really connecting the teaching, working with students, working, in community engaged projects at UMBC, as well as when I was at Tulane, where we did a lot of service learning projects. So the questions that go into that type of research, I think or that type of community engaged work, I think is really important. And then, constantly reckoning with my own methodology and checking in with folks that I work closely with is, constantly part of the process. I can always do more of it. And I'm always, ready for folks to say, no, we don't want to do that project, and being okay with that. So, I think those are the things that, I'm looking forward to talking to today. So.
That is so great and helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Fouts, for explaining your work with us. I think it's so important, as we've been talking all about positionality and place during this conversation, that we are kind of referencing where we're getting our work from, which is basic citations, as well as how we've been informed in our spaces and how we move. And with that, it is time to get into the lovely question and answer section of this event. I want to make sure that we honor everyone's time. So I think I'm going to try and focus on some really good meaty questions that you guys can talk either both amongst yourselves with this audience about your ideas, about kind of your processes for getting to your answers, which are obviously always evolving. And I won't be suggesting them to go to any specific person here, just so we can see what kind of conversation comes up. So the first more broad question is kind of talking about what are each of your challenges that you've had in your research and what do you feel like has gone wrong? One thing I always think about is, as someone who's like a young information professional, how do you begin to even find sources that are relatable to the work that you do, especially given that so many sources are, applauding objectivity. And also being mindful of context as far as history as well. So would anyone like to speak on that?
I'd be happy to first respond to that and then see how Lewis and Sarah feel about this. But as I was thinking through my notes and my past, I know that I've always maintained this desire to stay connected to the communities where we do our work. But the kind of work we do, especially in academia, demands that you focus on output, right? So you produce an article, you produce a book, you move on to the next project. And that's how we stay competitive. That's how we stay recognized in our field. That's how we get tenure and promotion, right? We have to pump out different projects. But sometimes the importance of the relationships we cultivate with the community where we're going to collect our data, right? And, we've moved away from using terms like informants, right? We talk about our interlocutors, we talk about our research consultants, our teachers. These are people who become friends and fictive family, right? I often refer to the folks who I build community with through research as kind of fictive kin. You don't want to just move on to the next project because you have relationships that are in place, and our work demands that we move on, right? You keep the machine going. This is part of kind of thinking about extractive labors of the academic enterprise and academic institutions in general. You have to keep producing, and so one thing that I've struggled with in the past and that I continue to struggle with in terms of like having distance from the communities where we do our work, you want to maintain relationships, but we're often limited with our time constraints, the demands to move on to a new project, and that the distance also makes it difficult to maintain relationships. So again, going back to the research I did as an undergraduate in Baltimore, again, I had a lot of personal connections to the project because it was as a Black woman, this was a historic African-American community in Baltimore that was constantly changing, and where I'd raised questions about the racial and class dynamics. And so I had relationships that I built there with people through volunteer initiatives that our professors at Towson help us set up, which I was going to speak about how that can actually be one way to serve the community's needs, right? Get students that are doing the research with you to engage in volunteer opportunities so that the pressing issues of the community can emerge through these informal interactions and kind of informal interviews and things that take place. So you have these relationships built through volunteer opportunities, by attending community meetings, through doing these interviews. But then I move on to the University of Florida to do my PhD, and it becomes more difficult to keep in touch with people, right? You lose touch. You feel bad that you haven't checked in with folks after a while. You realize that if you ever want to come back and circle back to some of those questions, it's been so long since you've reached out to them that you didn't feel guilty about it, right? Like, I haven't done a good job of maintaining this relationship. And now with the ongoing work that I'm doing in Martinique, up until COVID, I was lucky enough to have the resources to continue traveling to Martinique each year after my long-term field work. I was there every summer, not only to check in and update my data, but it became an opportunity to share my results back to the community in kind of non-academic settings, so that I could see if my findings were on the right track and whether or not they kind of agreed with some of the conclusions I was drawing, to get their feedback. That was part of the community engagement commitment that I had, not just extracting the information and coming away away with it and producing new knowledge, but finding ways to reciprocate. And so now with COVID, I haven't been back to the field in over 2 years because the first summer I had a baby, and then the following summer we had travel restrictions in place due to the pandemic. And so all of my field work is happening online, right? Trying to follow folks on social media, trying to check in. And there's this lingering guilt that like, I'm supposed to be there, right? I'm supposed to be there continuing these relationships. And so personally, that's a challenge that I've encountered that I've tried to figure out how to work around. And in listening to Lewis's podcast, I thought about the parachuting in. I think that's the expression you used in terms of the concerns over parachuting in to extract and then leaving with the story. We say that sometimes this can be alleviated through the methods of long-term ethnographic research, the long-term immersions that we are supposed to do through ethnographic field research. And sometimes this can be 6 months to 2 years where you're really immersed in the site. But those concerns over extraction are still present, especially when you come across someone whose story is so compelling and you want to figure out you want to figure out a way to tell it, to integrate it into your work, but there's a low likelihood of you encountering that person again or having the opportunity to really cultivate the relationship. And so personally, that's a challenge that I've encountered in terms of not wanting to do extractive research, but knowing that time constraints, demands on the kind of work we're supposed to be doing to keep our jobs and distance can get in the way of maintaining those relationships, right? And so that's something that I have to try to be honest and transparent about in my ongoing conversations with folks.
That's wonderful. I completely understand that. I think a lot of people are experiencing something very similar, even just on the basic level of journalists not being able to sit down at their interviewees, or even just like have those moments of getting photos of an encounter, especially I'm sure as you're doing a lot of dance research, you may want to have seen people dancing. That might have been nice. Lewis or Sarah, do you guys have anything you may want to add into this conversation?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of, kind of challenges in the field. And I think the time aspect is a really interesting thing to bring up, especially to juxtapose with journalism too, because we're still writing books 10 years later about the same thing and talking about it over and over about the same thing, right? And journalists are doing, a lot of, different areas, et cetera. But I was thinking about, in particular, a project that I did that was an oral history project, and I collaborated with a good friend who's a photographer, Fernando Lopez in New Orleans. And we did this, really kind of got paid money from a food organization to do a public humanities project to develop an archive on oral histories with a flea market in New Orleans and with Latin American food vendors. And, it was not a collaborative project at all. And at the time, I wasn't really thinking about it. I was like, it's just cool to get this archive. We should, really develop it. It's a cool like space. There's great food out here. But it wasn't really asking the questions of, do people even want their story told? Who is this for? Why are we doing this project? And really, what's the space it's going to be, where it's going to be presented? What's the power, none of the power questions I didn't ask that, with Lewis's list there. And Fernando was, we were both like excited about it, and it was certainly fun. But, as we were going through it, it was just kind of felt like we were being very extractive in the processes and, and really kind of not understanding what it meant. And I think Fernando, and definitely in conversations we have like retroactively, he was like, man, that was, just, I don't know, we could have done that so much better. We, didn't even need to do parts of the project. But, it was learning a lot, like, the steps, taking to, when we're talking to people, I had, friends that were food vendors in the market, but, trying to meet new people that we didn't really know well, we hadn't built rapport with, being told no, like, and we're certainly like, oh, totally, like, absolutely, like, I understand why you wouldn't want to just talk to strangers about your story. But also, not really kind of engaging with those questions really critically before going into that project. So I think that was, something I will write about, and I am writing about right now, is kind of grappling with those issues in doing that project in particular. And so, maybe I'll stop there, but, that's one of the challenges of really asking yourself, who is this for? What is this for? Before doing a project like that.
Lewis, were you thinking about adding something?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there is so much overlap. Like the first thing that came to my mind in response to this question is really related to the professional constraints, but more around audience, just that journalism is usually, when you're working for a journalism organization, you're producing a product, right? That there's customers, there's this other set of people who have often a different set of interests. And so I think, yeah, in the podcast episode about the end of extractive journalism, I think I talk about outlier media in Detroit, really kind of shifting that whole dynamic from like, so, I tell a story about me going to Detroit working for Marketplace. It's a business and economics show that's national, that doesn't even air on the local public radio station in Detroit, and talking to people about the housing crisis and foreclosures and losing their homes and all this kind of stuff there, and hearing these really personal stories. And and no matter how much like good intention and kind of follow up, staying in touch, relationship building with like the people I met in Detroit in that context, there's still this reality of like, I'm taking that and I'm shaping it for this audience that is really a spectator audience, right? Sort of looking from outside at Detroit, and at the folks who are talking and at their stories. And there's, like this assumption in journalism that the system works, that there's kind of a trickle down, that if we just like tell these bad policy things that are happening to these powerful people over here, then those people will, they'll read it in the New York Times and then they'll vote for the right thing, or they'll hear it on NPR and then they'll do the right thing. But that loop is often not actually getting closed. And so there's this real, I don't know. I feel like there was just a lot of unlearning for me after I left public radio, to get from the place of like, this seems bad, to like, oh, wow, I really participated in something that was very extractive, and also that's just kind of broken in terms of the theory of change. Like, how does this serve the people who are actually directly affected by this in a sort of material and concrete way, and not just in a way that's like, about making me as a producer feel a little bit better about how I went about it or whatever. And I think that relationship building is totally an important and beautiful part of that. But for national reporters, like if you stay for a week, you were there for a long time. Like the standards around what is extractive and parachuting in and whatever, it's just so far over into this world of plucking stuff out and bringing it to this other audience where there's no accountability, that it's kind of mind-blowing to start to think about what it would take to restructure sort of the whole system of news distribution to be really driven by communities and directly affected people. But right now, when you're in a national news organization, and there's a business incentive for that organization to get these listeners and readers, no matter what, it's very, very hard to push for that. Not impossible, but an ethical appeal along those lines is like not powerful enough in those contexts.
It's interesting because a few different things come to mind. When I graduated college, I did some time in public radio, and then my family is actually in Detroit. So I went to Detroit and met a lot of people that you mentioned who are working with Outlier, including the executive director, Candace Fortman. And I did a kind of, informational interview day at WDET, which is Detroit's public radio affiliate station. And I was really touched by the actual individuals that I met, who I think are doing really amazing work, and also was really reminded that that is not the space that we're going to see a lot of. There are more barriers to people actually being honest with themselves. I think sometimes when it comes to these public radio moments of being like, okay, well, I paid my $50 for the year, I got my tote bag, I clearly care about public journalism and the future of the journalist profession, but they're still very much so committed to a parachuting type of model, and specifically a model that's just very fast paced. So I think both you and Dr. Maddox Wingfield had been talking a lot about the importance of time, the importance of space. yeah, so that is, you guys really hit that out of the park, I will say. And we actually have a few questions from our live chat. The first of which, has anyone had an interlocutor, which I had not really known what that word meant until just now, express that they've been misrepresented or do not agree with the output? What did you do or would do? What does accountability actually look like?
I go Camille if you. Okay, I haven't had anyone express. It doesn't mean they haven't felt it. They just haven't expressed it. Like, it's very interesting. The accountability side, and I haven't always done this, but now, I did a big project with a lot of founders of the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice, and the founding in 2005 as a grassroots organization that emerged out of the injustices after Katrina. So going through with each of the organizers and founders and founding members, and sending them, after doing an oral history project that was very much from the Worker Center, wanted that project to be done. So that felt very different than the previous project that Fernando and I had done. And we both collaborated on the more recent project. So, so sending people their transcriptions, there's a couple, like if I pull a quote, I get permission first to use it, because I'm using stuff more often for different types of publications. There's a long quote I use from Toya X Lewis, who is one of the organizers, and asking her and sending her the video and being like, is it cool? I'm going to use this again in this space, and just really being very transparent with how I'm using those stories. I think is a way to potentially avoid the misrepresentation, and not always, right? But trying to be as transparent and accountable to those stories, etc.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially considering that, similar to what has been said, is that in academia, there is an expectation to constantly have a CV, have a whatever form of cataloging how much work you have done. And I think oftentimes that means people are taking a study that maybe the person may have thought was private and it is now public in varying different mediums. And just even opening up the process about how rights of sharing, public use, et cetera, can be a way to at the very least get respondents involved in the future of this kind of work. Yeah, is there anything else that anyone would like to add to that?
I had a kind of more subtle example of this that I just think might be interesting to talk about when, in terms of somebody giving me feedback about how they were represented. I had done a public radio story for the local station that I was working at in Ohio about, it was really about education and how folks who are undocumented were like navigating public education for their children, given the sort of fears about deportation and they're being separated from their children, and just like, and language barriers, and all kinds of things. So it was part of a series about immigration and undocumented folks, and I became quite close with the person who was kind of the main, in radio we would call a character in the story, and now I don't like that, but the person whose story I was telling in this piece, and we talked a lot and for a long time about her life story and all this stuff that she'd been through, which I won't go into the details of, but I did the 4-minute piece that's then like, look at all the stuff she's been through and how it's challenging for her as a mother who is undocumented, shepherding her children through public education, and played the story for her, when it was complete. And there wasn't anything that she was like, that wasn't factual or that didn't represent me correctly. But I said, what did you think about it? And she said, I just sound like sad. Like I sound like a sad person. And it was one of those moments where it was like, I thought that I had like done such a great job sort of like, you know, humanizing her and showing her struggle and all this stuff. And I feel like for her, she, yeah, was kind of giving me this feedback of like, this, the 4 minutes just like makes me sound like a victim. And that's not how I see myself.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, I feel like that there wasn't something that she was like, I want you to change this, but it was something about the constraints and the framing and maybe even like my voice and my tone and assumptions about the audience, right? That led to this feeling of like, I'm sort of putting this person's struggle on display to like show how sad it is and how victimized she is. And then what is it like to like be that person, which is ironic because like, you know, I've been that person, right? Like trans people are like depicted in this same sort of framework all the time as like one-dimensional victims. And just realizing, oh, I could do that to someone else and not even like realize that I was doing it in the moment, thinking I'm just making this really important like point.
Yeah. And I feel like this is something that kind of came up when we were tracing the history of journalism and thinking about how the 20th century codified a lot of understandings of objectivity, specifically when education frameworks were necessary. And I thinking about how I'm learning in my program about different learning outcomes. And I'm sure that journalist students, I mean, I'm not actually sure because I've never been a journalist student, but I'm sure enough that journalism students are still taught about this kind of linear path of research that doesn't allow one to even flip the question on its head and think, why is 4 minutes all I'm given? You know, what can this be done? What is the value of the 4 minutes that I have? And what is the value of the different types of footage that I'm gathering and how that can be worked in the future. Those are great answers. And then we're going to have, so this is our last question. So we're finishing up. This is actually a pretty extensive question as well, but I'm hoping that it can be quick and you can kind of just give us one of your favorite examples. So this is a question from Michelle Stefano, who is a wonderful partner at the Baltimore Field School. Hey, Michelle. I am curious about the panelist experience and how sharing research findings with community partners, listening to their feedback further shapes the research products, which I think is kind of something we've done a little bit about deliverables. And even as Sarah has talked about sharing with respondents, what type of distribution will be done for the work. So is there anything that any of you would like to add to this?
I do think it can be dependent on the type of the kinds of modalities that we use to present the research back, because I think one of the questions that had been prepared before was how do you know that the work you're doing should be for an academic audience or something along those lines. And for me, it's never an either or, it's more of a both and, right? I know I have to write for an academic audience because there are topics that are underexplored that need to contribute to the social scientific literature about certain phenomena that we observe, and you want to be able to establish your voice as contributing a new perspective to that academic conversation. But many of us that have this kind of ethical praxis of community engagement and non-extractive approaches are always simultaneously thinking about other modalities for communicating our ideas and for disseminating our results back to the community. And we have to think creatively beyond academic prose and beyond the textual forms of knowledge transmission and knowledge production in order to give back to the community so that it can translate to them, so that it can speak to their sensibilities and resonate with you know, in terms of thinking about affect and the embodied forms of knowing that comes up, that surfaces in my work. When I go back to Martinique to present ideas, I'm not going back to read a paper the way I would at a conference, right? I'm producing something like a short video clips. I'm engaging multilingualism because this is a diglossic speech community where both French and Creole is valorized, right? And so I think about ways of kind of code switching and performance as creative ways for disseminating complex ideas related to our social analysis. And so I do think it invites different kinds of feedback that we can then take back to the academic work that we're supposed to be producing for our colleagues and for journals and for books, you know, and it helps us think differently because we're inviting different kinds of feedback when we think about kind of multimodalities. I'm thinking about multimodal anthropologies and visual anthropology, being able to translate our ideas beyond the academic prose to our communities where we're doing the work. And I think that helps to break down some of the tensions around extractive research. Because they're not interested in they're not always interested in kind of the deep analysis and the kind of theoretical conversations that we're contributing to in our disciplines. They're looking for kind of actionable ways to apply what we've come to be experts on. They're interested in learning about the range of perspectives that we've come across, because sometimes their perspectives are rivaling and they may not always agree with what your other interlocutors are saying. And so it gives them an opportunity in kind of the non-academic language to engage in the conversation that's around your research. And so I do think it then can go back and help enhance the academic product that we have to come back and produce after we've had an opportunity to engage them and share the work back to them. So yeah, I think being reflexive, I think being stating the positionality, as Sarah did beautifully at the beginning, being vulnerable and stating like, okay, these are the power dynamics involved. This is why I got access to certain communities and why I didn't get access to other communities. The being too close to the topic, all of those kinds of tensions, I think, become resolved or almost resolved when we find ways to communicate that are unconventional in terms of what we're expected to do in academia. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I've been thinking a lot about how the classroom in general, or the meeting room, the conference room, is just a pretty limiting physical space for a lot of people, especially if you're talking about food, you're talking about dance, you're talking about, what people need in their direct access. Is there any final thoughts that Lewis or Sarah you would like to share about these thoughts? We're about 2 minutes till 7 p.m.
I'll be really quick. One project that I worked on, and this was from the Worker Center, came up with the idea for a project and approached me and were like, let's build a Black-led labor history timeline of New Orleans, because we want to be able to tell our own story of doing a lot of labor history, or doing labor movements, but also kind of the earlier history of that. And working with students at Tulane, we developed this timeline, and working with folks at the Worker Center. And then just the ways in which, making a public facing digital timeline that you can use on your phone, and the way that they've used it to do teach-ins, to do different kind of member education programming has been really cool. Just to kind of see how you can produce a more like public facing project that are actually part of kind of building power with an organization. So that was one of, I think, a way of not only giving back, it was their idea, we just helped them develop it and work in a collaborative project. So I'll end on that one.
Lewis, any final thoughts? You're the man of the hour, so to speak.
That makes me feel like the grandpa at dinner who's like, all right, I'm gonna sit.
I do love when my grandpas have dinner with me. I can't even lie, so I get it.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like, what I was thinking about just as Sarah was talking is how rad it is that the research that you're doing is actually integrated with community organizing, and that's in journalism, I feel like the conversation still is kind of, in more mainstream organizations at least, kind of stuck at like, how do we give back, or how do we do community engagement, and objectivity is the wedge. It's like we won't be objective anymore if we actually engage with organizing. But organizing is where like that more dynamic conversation about changing conditions can happen, and not just sort of having this like charitable relationship where we do a story about you and then we try to give back or something like that. So shifting those power dynamics, I think, really requires organizing. And yeah, I just feel excited to hear that sort of parallel conversation is happening really in a more advanced way in y'all's field. Thank you so much.
I will say that I think all the fields, as an information professional in library science, where I'm tasked with knowing a large level of research, all the fields are really starting to understand the value of being intentional at the very least. At least that's what we like to hope, especially as we're convening the Baltimore Field School. So I just want to quickly say a thank you to Red Emma's for having this event. I'm not sure if you would like any housekeeping things to say. I'd also like to thank Lewis, Camille, and Sarah for all three of you all speaking with us about your work, having really important tensions and kind of deliberations. It's necessary to the future of research, especially the future of journalism. And at that, I guess I'll leave it to you, Eno, if there's anything, or we can all go home and stay home, I guess, rather, and have a nice night.
Yeah, I'll just pop in and say thank you to everyone. This is absolutely wonderful. I'm a huge media criticism nerd, so for me, this is just like, I was telling my friends, like, to me, the highest form of celebrity is like, oh my God, an A-lister. They weren't on the media a couple of weeks ago. That's amazing. But yeah, so thank you so much. You can learn more about the Baltimore Field School at baltimorefieldSchool.org. Lewis, we have his book on our site, and it's in the conversation on the YouTubes and in the description of the video. And redemmas.org, and it's I believe, is it lewispants.com or .org to find the podcast?
Yeah, Lewis Pants, like trousers.com.
All right, thank you all so much. This is really wonderful, and yeah, we'll see you again soon.